Hello, Happy New Year and welcome to the first vlog of 2017. I've just been watching the lunchtime weather forecast on the telly, and although we have at the moment got beautiful blue skies and sunshine, which is rather lovely, it is cold, and overnight of course those clear skies mean it's going to get really cold because there's no cloud to hold the warmth in. In fact, they're predicting temperatures tonight of -5 degrees, and that is quite chilly. The canal will certainly freeze over, I'm sure, if that prediction comes true. Now, although I've mentioned my stove before, and I think I've even mentioned the central heating system, I've not done a dedicated video all about how you heat your narrowboat. So that's what this vlog is all about. It's probably fair to say that most narrowboats, not all, but most, have a solid fuel stove, and certainly people who live aboard their boats absolutely swear by them. There is nothing quite like that comforting orange glow of coal or wood to keep you warm on a chilly winter's night. Many narrowboaters also make use of a little heat-powered fan which just sits on top of the stove and pushes the heat along the length of the boat. The stoves burn either coal briquettes, such as I've got here, or some people prefer to burn wood, and many of them will forage for wood that they find alongside the canal. Free fuel is always a good thing, but you're supposed to let it dry out first for several months before you burn it, and that can be all a bit of a palaver. So coal is in many respects just more convenient, but obviously you have to buy it. A 25 kilogram bag of coal like this costs about £11, but you also have to lug the things around, and, well, they weigh a lot, 25 kilograms. It is, if nothing else, a good workout. People sometimes say to me, if it's cold enough for the canal to freeze over, then even with a stove surely on board you must be cold, right? Wrong. If you stack enough coal in this and open the bottom vent so as to get a good air draft going through the fire, it will become so hot that I kid you not, you can sometimes have the doors and windows of the narrowboat open because it's so blazingly warm in here, even if it's sub-zero outside. Obviously you've got to be a little bit careful. If you let this thing get too hot and leave the vents open at the bottom, you can end up with an out-of-control fire. But it really does get warm enough to keep you in t-shirt and shorts inside the boat, even on the coldest days. But although the warm, comforting glow of the stove is absolutely marvellous on a chilly winter's day or night, there are downsides to burning coal or wood. 2 or 3 times a day I end up having to stir the coals to make any ash drop through to the tray at the bottom, and then go and empty the ash as well. And every time you do that, no matter how careful you try to be, there is a huge cloud of ash comes out of the tray, and everything just gets dusty and filthy. Your hands, the boat, it's all a bit mucky. Not to mention constantly having to clean the glass of the stove, unless you've got one of those Swish stoves that does some clever self-cleaning mechanism, which mine clearly doesn't. By now you might be thinking, well, you like the idea of a stove, but frankly all the palaver of mucking about with coal or wood, the ash, the dirt, the emptying it out, the where do you store the coal? You store it on the roof, do you store it in the well deck, the lugging it about is all a bit of a palaver. But don't worry, because you can have a stove that isn't coal or wood fired. You can have a diesel stove. There are a fair few of these on boats, but that said, I don't think I know anyone who's got one. At least, not on a narrowboat. I do know a chap who has a diesel stove on his sailing boat over in Denmark. So, for a quick education on everything you ever wanted to know about diesel stoves, let's cross to our Danish correspondent.
Hi, it's Mads and Jökull from the YouTube channel Sail Life. The two of us live aboard my 30-foot sailboat year-round in the northern parts of Denmark, and on the cold, frigid winter nights we get over here, I rely on a single heat source to keep us warm, and that's the stove you see right here behind me. It's a Reflux Model 66 diesel stove, and there are a lot of upsides to using a Reflux stove to heat your boat. First off, the stove is completely silent. There are no pumps, no fans, just silence. You can get the Model 66 with a window so that you can sit back and enjoy looking at the flames. The stove is also available with a cooktop that is great for heating water for coffee or tea. Diesel is fed into the stove via gravity. Here aboard my boat, I've got a day tank on the other side of the bulkhead here behind me. Every 2 or 3 days, I transfer diesel from the main tank to the day tank with a small electric diesel pump. It takes about 2 or 3 minutes. After that, gravity takes care of the rest, and that's why the stove is completely silent. Here aboard my boat, I generally turn the stove on at some point in October and then leave it on until May. So during that period of time, the stove runs 24/7. But igniting the stove isn't difficult. It's just a matter of removing the cooktop, adding a bit of alcohol, and then igniting that alcohol with a lighter. When the burning alcohol has heated up the stove, you can then switch on the diesel. That is done on the regulator on the back of the stove. It's just a matter of turning that little knob to the lowest position. After a few minutes, you can see that the stove is starting to burn diesel because the flames are slightly more yellow. After having lit the stove, it's basically just a matter of leaving it alone until spring. So the reflex stoves are great because they're completely silent, they use no electricity, and you can leave them on for extended periods of time. There's also a fourth thing that I really like about the reflex stoves, and that's the fact that they do a really good job of drying out the boat. Right now I've got a relative humidity around 30% here inside the boat, and it's going to stay like that all winter. I love my reflex stove, and I couldn't imagine heating the boat in another way, but there are a few things you should be aware of before purchasing a reflex stove. The stove doesn't come with a thermostat, it comes with this regulator here. You adjust the amount of heat the stove puts out by turning this little knob here, and you will have to do that manually. The second and final thing you should be aware of before purchasing a reflex stove is the fact that you can, in very gusty winds, experience downdraft. So what happens is the stove gets put out and then it turns itself back on again because it's still very, very warm. So that's great. The only slightly annoying thing is that when it does this, it can emit a tiny bit of diesel smoke inside the boat. Now it's not dangerous or anything like that, it just smells a little bit. But the smell goes away quickly, and for me it only happens about 3 times a year, so it's not really that big of an issue, but I thought you should know. So these were my thoughts on heating your boat with a reflex stove.
And there are other manufacturers of diesel stoves as well. Bubble is the one that immediately springs to mind, but I expect there are others. Thanks very much indeed, Mads, for that comprehensive overview of diesel stoves. Now, whichever type of stove you have on a narrowboat, whether it's wood burning, coal burning or diesel, there is a problem. My stove is at the back of the saloon, and because the layout of the boat is quite open plan, it means it manages to heat up the saloon, the galley and the dinette quite effectively. Unfortunately, even with the little fan on top of the stove, very little of the heat manages to get down this corridor, either to the bathroom or to the bedroom, so it can be a bit chilly at night. For the many boats where the stove is on one of the corners next to the front doors, the heat obviously has even further to travel to get to the back of the boat, and lots of the heat will be lost through those front doors. So what you also find on a lot of narrowboats is water-filled central heating radiators, just like you'd get in a house. And just like in a house, you can have thermostatic temperature control valves on them as well. My boat has a radiator here in the bedroom, one in the bathroom which cannot be turned off and has no thermostatic valve on it, and that is for technical reasons, to avoid the whole system overheating and exploding. I also have a radiator in the dinette, and there's one in the lounge as well. And if you're wondering, this is what my diesel heating unit looks like. It's made by Eberspacher and is in the engine room, which is why it's a little bit tricky to film. There are other manufacturers, Cabola, Webasto, but they're all essentially doing the same thing, heating hot water and pumping it round. The whole system's controlled by a little 7-day timer unit, which is at the back of the bedroom. The advantages of a radiator system are that they are very quick to heat up and heat the boat up, and of course because you've got them on a timer you can set them to come on and off whenever you want. The downsides of them are that the heater unit is incredibly noisy, and because it's in the engine room behind the bedroom, you really don't want that system running while you're trying to get to sleep. Weirdly, it's really quiet outside the boat, but it's really noisy. It's like a jet engine. It's like Concorde is trying to take off inside your boat when the unit is running. And of course it's an electromechanical unit. You've got a pump trying to push all the water around, you've got the burner unit that's firing up diesel to heat the water, so you've got more complexity, and ultimately the unit will need servicing, it can go wrong. Compare that with a simple stove in which you chuck some logs or some coal and set light to them. We've pretty much covered how you actually heat your boat now, but if you simply take a 50-foot long steel tube that's sitting in 3 feet of cold canal water and heat it up, the heat is going to disappear fairly quickly. So another important aspect of being warm on a narrowboat is how well your narrowboat is insulated and what it's insulated with. This is what you mostly find in modern boats, spray foam insulation, which, as the name implies, is spewed from a giant aerosol onto the metal walls of the boat. It comes up to the level of the wooden battens onto which the internal walls will be fastened, and it's sprayed onto the walls, the ceiling, in fact throughout most of the boat. It gets into all the nooks and crannies with no need for actually cutting out shapes from slabs of solid insulating material, but it is a specialist job to apply. It's sprayed even at the back of the boat in the engine room, across all the surfaces, and you should find it around where the water tank is installed as well. One other quite common method for insulating narrowboats, particularly older narrowboats I think, is polystyrene sheets, and they do work, although I don't think they work as well as the modern spray foam. There is, however, one big caveat on polystyrene, and that is that if you put it in contact with electrical cables, there is a certain type of PVC used in electrical cables that degrades over time. It has a chemical reaction with the polystyrene, and that can lead to the wire becoming brittle and cracked and ultimately can short circuit the wiring. Now if you're lucky that'll just blow a fuse, but there have been instances of fires being started because of wiring being in contact with polystyrene, and over time the two wires short out and then you've got a fire on your hands. I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily, but it has happened. So if you are fitting out a boat with polystyrene or rewiring a boat with polystyrene insulation, the wiring really needs to go into a separate conduit that keeps it away from the insulation. Just before I finish, a quick word about windows. My boat, like many others, only has single glazed units, and not only do these let the heat out, but they do suffer from condensation. You can get double glazing on narrowboats, but it is expensive, especially if you want to retrofit it. I think we'll draw this video to a close. I'm sure there's something I've forgotten, but if you can think of what it is, do let me know in the comments below. Any questions, also drop them down below. I'll do my best to answer, and if I don't have an answer, I'll do my best to find one out for you. Thanks for watching. Cheers now. Bye bye.